Hello, welcome to the Coronavirus Diaries. Today I'm very happy to welcome freelance journalist Nick Aspinwall. Nick, thank you for joining us today.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Where are you based at the moment?
I am currently in Taipei. So here in Taiwan, it really has been a model response to the coronavirus. I generally go between here in Taiwan and Manila. So there, of course, are just two very different stories.
So yeah, these are the two basically countries as well that I want to kind of discuss with you today. First Taiwan and then the Philippines. As you said, the response has been very, very different. In Taiwan, whenever we read the media these days, Taiwan has been praised for its response to the virus. Um, which measures were taken in place by the government and the authorities, and how can it be kind of seen as an example for other countries around the world?
Yes. So Taiwan, the first thing is that it just took this very seriously from the beginning. It was already well equipped to deal with the pandemic. Of course, it had the experience with SARS in 2003, and it also has a very strong public health system. It has national health insurance, and that's been extremely valuable here in Taiwan throughout this. So on December 31st, when authorities here in Taiwan first heard about an unknown virus at that time in Wuhan, it started screening passengers arriving from Wuhan the same day. It also sent an email to the WHO, which warned of the virus and the possibility of human-to-human transmission, which the WHO didn't confirm for weeks later. But here in Taiwan, authorities had already begun to prepare, and that has paid off in dividends. It mobilized the Central Epidemic Command Center to coordinate the national response to the virus. It did things like it expanded screening measures over time. It banned entry to travelers from China earlier than many other countries, and it also, in late January, when things started to when public concern over the virus really started to rise in Taiwan, around the time it had its first case, it immediately bolstered its face mask production. There was a very brief period where there was a shortage of surgical masks. The government sent military to mask production facilities. It provided equipment for producing masks to factories, and it's increased its production to around 15 million a day at this point. So, and there's been a rationing system for mask purchases that has allowed Taiwan to have a surplus of masks now, which is why it's able to donate to other countries, which I'll get to in a bit. But I think the really a really important point that that I always like to make clear is just the communication between the government and the people has been, by and large, has been very good. The health minister holds daily press conferences. He often responds directly to public concerns. The relevant agencies are active on social media. They often make very relatable posts. There's been a very, a very coordinated and effective strategy of making sure that the public is very aware of the severity of the virus, but also making sure they don't panic. So the government has been very transparent, and I think just by virtue of that, it's won public trust. So it is certainly accurate to say that Taiwan's democracy has been a very large factor in the effectiveness of its response.
Yeah, it's been similar here as well in terms of communications, the issue of transparency and kind of daily briefings. And do you think, China has been very not, especially at the beginning of the crisis, they didn't say anything, that there was no transparency whatsoever. Taiwan has a very kind of complicated relationship with China. Do you think that it learned from looking at China and what not to do as well in terms of communication transparency? Taiwan has probably also learned not to trust China. at all in terms of what its message
Mm.
is, in terms of messaging.
Right, absolutely. Taiwan certainly was not ready to trust China, and ultimately that helped Taiwan prepare a lot earlier than other countries. Just by knowing that the whatever information was coming out of China might be inaccurate, might be delayed, as the Chinese government ended up not providing the updated data in the first few weeks of the pandemic in Wuhan. So yeah, that's certainly been a factor here in Taiwan. It's the current government especially has I think has learned how taking the Chinese government at its word can be very detrimental. The people of Taiwan by and large understand that as well.
Yeah. So we were speaking about the issue of masks. We know that Taiwan has shipped thousands of masks to some of its neighbors, but also the United States, Europe, because Europe, especially France, has been really looking for masks, and it has shipped
Right.
as well masks to the Caribbean. How is Taiwan currently placing itself on the international stage when it comes to providing aid to countries around the world? And can we see it as a kind of a victory over China's own kind of mask diplomacy?
Right. It's a very good question, and Taiwan has certainly been able. Taiwan has always, especially under the current administration of Taiwan, it has been working really hard to secure its and to bolster its international presence as Taiwan. And Beijing has done many things to try and limit that. So Taiwan's ability to export masks, and there were two mass waves of there were two mass there was one 10 million masks were shipped to countries in the US and European countries, and then and diplomatic allies, and then 6 million were shipped to other countries in the Americas and South and Southeast Asia and Australia. So just in the last month or so, it has it's donated 16 million masks. So it's also between that and the efficiency of its own response and its very public willingness to want to help other countries, not just national governments, but state and local governments with their own responses. That has certainly helped bolster Taiwan's international standing, which is a big political victory for the government as well. In contrast with China, its own mask diplomacy, and it's sending PPEs, test kits to countries in Europe, for instance, has had its share of problems with things like defective equipment, and also concerns over China's motives, which have been only exacerbated by what some of its diplomats have been saying about its I'll say mask diplomacy, although it's more than mask diplomacy. So if there's, if Taiwan is able to just let the world contrast it with China, then I think that the government here probably feels that works in its
benefit. How do you think it will kind of affect the China-Taiwan relationship in the long term? Because I think since the last elections in Taiwan, we've seen the relationship kind of really changing fast. Do you think this pandemic will have a long-term effect on the relationship between both countries?
It certainly will, just by virtue of bolstering Taiwan's international standing, and we will wait and see if there are some very concrete changes. For instance, if Taiwan is able to gain observer status at the World Health Assembly, if that is held next month. If we see things like that, then those will be those will be measures that Beijing, of course, takes very seriously as things that harm its own dreams of unifying Taiwan with China. So there's no question that anything that bolsters Taiwan's standing, and also anything that decreases public trust in the Chinese government, is going to affect the relationship between Taiwan and China. However, of course, it is a very deep question, and one that we will find the answers day by day, week by week. So far, Beijing's messaging on what Taiwan has been doing has been mostly aimed at its own domestic audience. When it's critical of Taiwan, it knows that won't play as well in the U.S. and Europe, for instance, but it will play well domestically. There's a whole other kind of worms there with how there's just been such an increase in xenophobia in China, right, and just anti-foreigner sentiment that seems to be driven by the state. So that's yes, that's something that right now I'm not quite sure if Beijing has decided how it's going to handle this going forward on an international stage. But as we've seen in the Taiwan-China dynamic for years, anything can change.
Exactly.
It can change tomorrow.
Yeah, China's communication strategy these days seems to be changing all the time. Let's move on to the case of the Philippines. You said earlier today that the situation was very different there. So I want to start first with a question, how is the government handling this? What is the state of the spread of the virus? We know that the president is very, very controversial because he's very, he likes to rage at people and say very controversial statements. So what's the situation over there now, do you think?
Right, and that's certainly continued during the pandemic. So it is a very opposite approach. Yes, Duterte in the Philippines has often taken the so-called strongman approach to address problems, and that's happened here as well. It's strong criticism from rights groups, and I think that what we've noticed is the government there has been just really open to, it's received a lot of criticism, and a lot of its moves have been reactionary to that criticism. And, potentially as it realizes that there was a lack of planning and foresight. Manila did, the island of Luzon did lock down quite early. I believe it was March 18th. Manila began a community quarantine on March 15th, and the island went into lockdown a few days later. So that was relatively early compared to other countries in the region. Whether or not that was able to slow the spread of the virus, it's hard to tell because there has not been mass testing. Medical facilities are overwhelmed. Even now, outside of Luzon, there aren't centers that can process tests in the islands. So tests have been transported back to Manila. For people who still have to work, social distancing in a place as dense as Manila is absolutely possible. And there have been, food and financial relief has been slow to come for, quite a few communities have not got it. So it's been a very chaotic response from the get-go, and that is still continued. The one theme that we see is that when there is criticism or when it feels like Duterte and his administration are potentially losing control, even if in the court of public opinion, then that's when a lot of those stronger measures start being proposed or enacted.
Yeah, he's known, he's gained a reputation for cracking down on human rights activists, journalists, anyone who criticizes his government, but also how is he managing the situation with like poor or urban populations? How is basically everything that he was doing before, how is it basically accelerated now?
Right. So for urban poor populations, there was an incident in San Roque, which is a poor community in Quezon City, part of Metro Manila, and on March 31st, they protested. Whether or not it was a planned protest is pretty unclear. It seems more likely that what happened is they believed that food relief was finally going to arrive. It hadn't arrived in over 2 weeks, so they went out to the street. But instead, they were met by police, and a conflict arose, and 21 people were arrested. And it was in response to that Duterte issued his order that quarantine violators associated with activist groups, he said to police and military, shoot them dead. So that was, of course, that sparked a public outcry, predictably. But that's, those communities have just felt, for a long time, even before this outbreak, they've often felt neglected, like social programs are not reaching them. I visited San Roque actually the day before the lockdown began, and they had all of the fears that they expressed to me. It seems that they came true. There were places there that there was no running water. People couldn't wash their hands. People were afraid that if they're not able to work, they're living week by week, paycheck to paycheck, and they won't be able to feed their families. They can't afford to panic buy. People would tell me, we can't panic buy, we can only panic. And that was a lot of that came true. It was just very slow. It took the government a long time to announce any clear plan for providing financial relief, providing food relief, and it's come very slow, and it makes it exceedingly likely that even when the peak of the virus subsides in the Philippines, there will be just many more problems with poverty, food security, and things like that.
Yeah, if there's one thing I think this pandemic has done kind of around the world is kind of really reveal a lot of the socioeconomic equalities of societies around the world, and some people have access to healthcare and just basic water. So some people just don't, and I know the Philippines is yet another example. A final issue I want to talk to you about. We've been talking a lot about on this podcast about the state of misinformation and propaganda and conspiracy theories about the coronavirus. And it's something that we've noticed around the world. It's a problem, be it here or in the Philippines. I know that Twitter suspended hundreds of accounts in the Philippines for violating its rules. Can you tell us a little bit about this, and more generally about Duterte's kind of role in spreading misinformation and conspiracy theories?
Sure, yeah. So what happened there when earlier this month when Twitter suspended hundreds of accounts, they had been using specific hashtags in support of Duterte. This happened right after the San Roque incident I mentioned before, when Duterte said she's dead. After that happened, there was a very large the hashtag Oust Duterte Now was trending on Twitter globally. Of course, it came from people in the Philippines who were infuriated at what Duterte had said and just the overall ineffectiveness of the response to the coronavirus. So after that happened, it seemed like accounts in a originated and started using pro-Duterte hashtags in a very inorganic way. And it was about a week later that Twitter suspended. It said hundreds of those accounts, according to the report in the Washington Post. So that's it's a very it's something we've seen a lot of in the Philippines. Back when Duterte was campaigning for president, there were lots of these online troll armies that we would see that seem to generate a lot of inauthentic support. And it's become known that there are PR experts who are hiring hiring Filipinos to create fake accounts and manipulate online discussions, often in support of a political candidate. There has been basically no pushback from the Philippine government against this, as it seems like they are often the ones who are benefiting. So it's been called by disinformation experts a breeding ground for international practices. So it's it's quite likely that what we see in the Philippines is going to continue to be replicated around the world.
All right, thank you so much, Nick, for joining us today, and especially since it's getting quite late where you are. And I hope we'll be able to follow up soon, especially regarding the situation in the Philippines and how this virus is spreading there, especially among poor communities. We'll be speaking later this week about the situation in India as well, where in some of the slums, physical distancing is just impossible. So I'm looking forward to hear more about what's going on over there in the Philippines.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I hope you're staying safe and healthy where you are.
You too. You too. Thank you so much. Bye.